Welcome for another webcast here at First Things Magazine. I'm Mark Bauerlein, Senior Editor at the magazine, and today we have Patrick Deneen joining us for another discussion of American culture, politics, and other issues that come up. Patrick is known well to First Things readers, but a little background. He was an English major as an undergraduate, he tells me, but he moved into political science where he got his doctorate from Rutgers University. He has been a professor at Princeton, Georgetown, and has been at Notre Dame since 2012. He's the author-editor of several books, including The Odyssey of Political Theory from 2000 and Democratic Faith from 2005. He wrote an important essay in First Things entitled Unsustainable Liberalism. It was the centerpiece of a forum that First Things did in August of 2012. Today's main topic is an essay he wrote a few months ago in the wake of the Indiana affair, which we'll go into here. It's a short piece entitled The Power Elite. But it occurs to me just before we get into that, people might be interested in the title Unsustainable Liberalism, and so I could ask you, Patrick, why is liberalism unsustainable?
That's a great question, Mark. The point I was making in that essay is really a Tocquevillian point. It comes really from the insight of Alexis de Tocqueville in Democracy in America. And what Tocqueville observed about democracy, liberal democracy in 1830s, was that there was a kind of logic built into liberal democracy that wasn't fully manifesting itself when he was looking at America in the 1830s, but which he thought over time would become more fully itself. Its logic would play out. And he feared that logic, the internal logic of liberalism, which he believed would really lead to two, what we would think of as contradictory outcomes. On the one hand, a kind of rampant atomistic individualism, and on the other hand, a kind of pervasive statism. In our politics today, we tend to think of these two things in some ways as opposites. You have the party of individualism against the party of statism. Tocqueville thought that the inherent logic of liberal democracy would lead to both of these becoming our kind of ontological reality. And he argued that if we didn't want that outcome, what we needed to do was to preserve aspects of our society, practices that in some ways rubbed against the logic of liberal democracy, and in particular a kind of rich, thick civil society of associations, of families, of communities, of neighborhoods. But that he feared over time these would actually begin to weaken and eventually be eviscerated by this internal logic. So my essay was really an effort to sort of play out some of Tocqueville's arguments in the light now of several decades, century and decades later, how in fact Tocqueville's argument has played itself out now to the point where it's no longer prophecy, it's history.
I think this is another case where Tocqueville is worth going back to again and again. His prescience is extraordinary in his understanding of American life, even back then. Our topic today primarily is your essay, The Power Elite, which came out a few months ago in the wake of the Indiana situation. And let me first ask you, before getting into the specifics of that essay, what was the Indiana situation? Before getting to the way it played out, what was leading up to the Indiana issue?
Well, Indiana, like many states, did not have a Religious Freedom Restoration Act. And the way that the the federal Religious Freedom Restoration Act has been construed by the courts is that while protections are given under federal statute to religious entities, to churches, to people of faith, it's not granted under state law. And so after this finding, a great number of states have actually now passed their own versions of Religious Freedom Restoration Act. So Indiana wasn't doing anything different than has already taken place in something on the order of 25 or 30 states already, which have, in one form or another, a Religious Freedom Restoration Act. Of course, what was happening was a real change in the legal, political, and social landscape, where this is now being construed, religious freedom issues generally, is being construed as an effort to roll back or to prevent implications arising from gay marriage and all of the various implications of that. And so the opposition that arose was really quite distinctive from what had been, before that time, a fairly easy passage of these laws in a variety of states.
Right, and you note in the essay that when the Indiana leaders were conceiving of this law, they had no idea that they were doing something that was distinctive, that would yield the response that it did. I'm going to read to you what you wrote in the second paragraph here of the Power Elite. Mike Pence, as governor of Indiana, Asa Hutchinson, governor of Arkansas, and the Republican Party were not blindsided by opposition to RFRA by gay rights activists. Of course, everyone expected that would happen. What knocked them back were major corporations such as Apple, Walmart, and Angie's List, and organizations such as the NCAA that denounced the law, in many cases announcing boycotts of Indiana. Had the only appreciable opposition to RFRA come from gay rights activists, RFRA would have been a smashing political success for Republicans. It would have made the right enemies while generating gratitude and energy in the base, on the right. They did not expect their usual friends in corporate America to join the opposition. And here is where you come in with the judgment, which was an idiotic miscalculation given the fact that establishment outrage scuttled the Arizona RFRA last year. Okay, so they'd seen something coming. But what happened in Arizona?
Well, in Arizona, a similar effort to pass a version of Religious Freedom Restoration Act protections for conscience protections was opposed, and was opposed from other sources, also from corporate entities, from major business entities. So what I wrote there was that I think, or what I really meant to say there was that Republican leaders have, until that point, I think, were slow in understanding that their usual friends in corporate America were actually not going to be with them on this issue, on what used to be an uncontroversial form of legislation that, let's remember, passed unanimously in the Senate as a federal law, passed unanimously. In the Senate and overwhelmingly in the House. It was co-sponsored in the Senate by Ted Kennedy, and I believe it was Orrin Hatch co-sponsored. So it was a bipartisan issue. So,
and the Indiana law was like other state laws, modeled on RFRA federal law.
Yeah, there's been debate over whether or not certain aspects of it would have given more protections to particularly private business owners, and there were ways that it could be construed that it might have. But that's always going to be, that would have been a question, because there have been pretty extensive case law that doesn't grant to private business owners the kinds of protections that are given to church and religious institutions.
I haven't seen this, but have there been any efforts by activists, and then assisted by corporate America and organizations like the NCAA, to go after existing RFRA state laws, demanding that those be repealed? I haven't seen any of that.
Well, there have actually been, there's been a little bit of discussion of whether RFRA should be amended or changed at the federal level, and which could have implications then at the state level as well. And in particular to remove any RFRA protections when it comes to issues regarding gay marriage or benefits or practices or activities relating to homosexuality. Mm-hmm. So essentially putting off of the protected category anything that could be seen as discriminatory to gays. Mm-hmm. That, of course, right now with the Republican Congress, that's probably not likely, but there are actually discussions taking place about that.
What happened? So the Indiana law passes the legislature, and I don't recall any of the publicity, the reaction before that. Maybe there was some early discussion if they pass it. But I don't recall corporate America, at least, coming in until after the fact. What happened?
Well, this was a piece of
Because
legislation.
you live in Indiana.
I do live in Indiana, so this was pretty close to home. There was obvious opposition to the bill from the kinds of activists in legal circles, in gay activist circles. There was also some corporate opposition from some, particularly Indiana-based corporations, that had signaled an initial opposition, but didn't, as I recall at least, didn't threaten anything like boycotts, didn't threaten to move out of the state. It was only after the bill was passed that there seemed to be a kind of gathering storm of opposition that became almost a kind of mutual reinforcement between the activists and the corporations, and that as more corporations came in, more activists, often from out of state, were becoming vocal about the Indiana legislation. You had absurdity upon absurdity piling up with governors from states that had RFRA laws on the books, state RFRA laws, for example, the state of Connecticut, telling their employees that they would not be allowed to travel to the state of Indiana, which had passed a law almost identical to that one that existed in Connecticut. But once the kind of fever pitch arose, everyone was jumping on board, and at that point I think it was concluded that the legislation had to be changed, or Indiana was in serious danger of losing a lot of a lot of its tourism, a lot of its convention business. And
Indianapolis is a very big convention city.
Absolutely.
And the NCAA is very
Which,
important.
of course, the Final Four was being held in Indianapolis just a couple of weeks hence.
Which means how many millions and millions of dollars to the Indiana economy. So there was clear, financial blackmail behind it. And there's corporate America. And here's what you say about corporate America. You note that it might have first appeared strange to people because corporations, you write, and business leaders almost always avoid political statements and announcements, recognizing that such declarations have the effect of unnecessarily alienating potential customers. You don't want to turn off anyone from your product. Corporations live in constant fear of bad publicity that can ruin a brand carefully erected through millions of dollars of advertising and publicity. Why step into a heated political debate and unnecessarily turn half your customers away? You have an answer to that, which is the logical one. The decision by Apple, Walmart, and Apple's CEO had a Washington Post editorial, which had a lot of the irrational alarm about what this law would mean. He's gay, and so he was speaking from his heart, he said, but he didn't even quote from the law. There was no evidence in his editorial that he was even familiar with the details of the law. But the decision by Apple, Walmart, I think that was a shock to a lot of social conservatives. Walmart?
NASCAR.
NASCAR was on? I did not know that. Okay. Eli Lilly, Angie's List, that wasn't a surprise, and so on, was a business decision. Even more, a marketing decision. How so?
I think what's extraordinary about what happened is you have corporations stepping into what could be viewed as still a very live political debate that has, by any polling measurement, fairly equal split in the population. I mean, it's a very close split. You see obvious trends toward acceptance of gay marriage, pretty significant percentages favoring it among younger people, but still very close if you look at the general population. So as I was saying there, when there's an issue of which you have pretty divided views, corporate America tends not to want to step into the middle of that. You don't see them making major pronouncements on abortion politics, for example. That would sort of be seen as sort of a major marketing snafu if that were to happen. But what the corporate, almost unanimous corporate support for, or I should say opposition to the Indiana RFRA law signaled was that the gay rights movement had been pretty much entirely successful in casting gay marriage as the equivalent of the new civil rights movement, and that opposition to gay marriage was tantamount essentially to a form of racism. That corporate America had signaled that that argument had been so successful, they had no compunction stepping into what was a live and very split political debate and declaring that they were going to be on the side of proponents of gay marriage because the decision had been widely taken that they no longer had to pay any heed to those who were opposing. And now you're talking about pretty much, the vast numbers of Christians and people of serious religious faith in this country. And that is I think, a watershed moment in American history in many respects, in which corporate America basically says, we have no respect or basic cognizance of your view.
I have to say, it was a shock to me that corporate America would jump into this and take that position, precisely because what you said, the numbers on this, especially in conservative states, are dangerous for them to do so.
What's striking is that you have seen no calls for boycotts of Apple. No. You've seen no calls for boycotts of Walmart from these Christians. No. And so there's a kind of lack of energy or somehow a kind of doubt, it seems to me, that has pervaded those who are in the opposition to this movement.
Which, as you say, made it probably a good marketing decision, because they certainly got a lot of very positive publicity out of it. I mean, even conservative media, I don't recall attacking the corporations for their position. Fox News, for instance, and they certainly were going to get super positive reviews from the liberal media, which outnumber conservative media. And when the governor of Connecticut and what was the mayor of Seattle, the president of San Francisco State University, this was one of my favorites, he said that his university would not fund any travel by the professors if they're going to a conference in Indiana or a meeting of some kind. I don't recall this ever happening in my lifetime, where actually a governor says, we're boycotting another state. This for me, maybe, I don't even remember during the civil rights movement there was anything like this.
No, it was truly extraordinary, and of course the other aspect of this that I write about in the essay was a moment that happened in the course of this, in which the Indiana media was looking for some kind of evidence that somewhere in Indiana there was someone who was intending to use this law to do exactly what people were saying it would be done, which would be to discriminate in a private business, to discriminate against a gay set of customers. And an Indiana newscaster went on a fishing expedition in a small sort of backwater town not far from where I live in Walkerton, Indiana, found a pretty, very basic pizzeria in a strip mall whose family is, kind of struggling to get by, and on camera asked the question, would you serve homosexuals? And the answer was, yes, we'll serve homosexuals, but we wouldn't serve a gay wedding. And the outpouring of denunciation and vitriol and hatred that then was rained upon this pizza shop and these owners was, it was unlike pretty much anything I've ever seen. Mm-hmm. And again, what struck me about this moment was here you had, by and large, those who have declared themselves to be very much in the progressive liberal camp going after a set of people who, by any claims of liberals and progressives, that these are the people who they're trying to stand up for, the people who are living on the margins of our economy, who have been struggling to make ends meet, but who, because of their stand against gay marriage, now became the most hated people in America. as a result of that.
The idea that a strip mall pizza joint would ever be asked to cater a wedding shows you just how absolutely bizarre, phony, false, fabricated this entire situation was, and yet it did its work, right? It did its cultural, political job, and what struck me was that the pile-on, you know, and you mentioned in here at one point the glee, the aggression, the ferocity that this evoked. I mean, I looked at it and said, something strange is going on in our country.
Right. You know, you think about a country that used to valorize the Mr. Smith Goes to Washington or the George Baileys of It's a Wonderful Life. Well, in a way, this is the kind of small-town America that we used to praise in our films and in our culture. And I think now you could say those values are seen as deeply suspect by the broader culture. And what we have now is a kind of globalized liberal progressivism that is represented, I think, by the corporations and by what I call the power elite, political, social, educational, the professoriate, the media, that has become the de facto cultural norm in our country. It's no longer the kind of the small town, the Miracle on 34th Street kind of homely values. Those are now seen as dangerous, as backward, as recidivist. What used to be seen as, in some ways, as the values that we should hold as a country, that will keep us together, that will sustain us through good times, through bad times, right? The kind of community that sustains George Bailey in his trials, right? That comes out and brings the $8,000 that he needs. Right. That kind of America is gone. Yes. I think that what this moment really brought home to me was that America is gone, and we're living in a different America now. And it's America that I think many of us find now a strange land. That we're living in somewhere that's very strange, it's very foreign to us. And that, in a certain sense, as a Christian, that's what Augustine says we're always going to be in some ways living in. Maybe it was an illusion to think we were at home in America. But in another way, it really represents a watershed moment.
It feels very different from 10 years ago or 20 years ago. Whichever president, Democrat or Republican in the White House, it's different now. And that I think the shakeup is about sort of corporate America, Republican Party, establishment, authority figures on the right, and then, you know, the ordinary people, small business owners, people living in rural America. I think there's a split there, and I'm going to read something you wrote here that I think is a nice summary of the ideological shift that is going on. Today's corporate ideology has a strong affinity with the lifestyles of those who are defined by mobility, ethical flexibility, liberalism, whether economic or social, a consumerist mentality in which choice is paramount, and a progressive outlook in which rapid change and creative destruction are the only certainties. Okay? That's where we are, and to continue, you say that corporate America have joined forces with the Republicans on economic matters. They want low taxes, they want fewer regulations. They've joined Democrats on social matters. And social matters for Democrats means freedom, choice, individualism, and consumption. Is that?
That's correct. I think what, for many of us growing up, probably in the wake, the shadow of the Cold War, there was a kind of sense that Main Street values and Wall Street values were sort of consonant, that in the opposition to communism, that broadly speaking, economic actors had the interests of Main Street at heart. But what I think this Indiana moment should have made really evident to us is that was a kind of marriage of convenience. It wasn't necessarily a marriage built of perfectly compatible partners. Instead, it was a marriage of convenience in which a kind of this ethic that I describe, certainly in the corporate world, is really now consonant with what you could say are the liberal wings of both of our political parties. the liberal wing, that's to say the kind of free market, in particular the kind of globalizing market wing of the Republican Party, and the kind of sexual liberation movement of the Democratic Party. And what's interesting is that the two parts of those parties that don't represent those wings, that's to say the social conservative side of the Republican Party, and what you could say is the kind of the economic side of the Democratic Party that seeks to at least rein in some of these excesses. Both of those parts of those parties are losing, if you think about it, right? I mean, the Democrats will complain until they're blue in the face about economic inequality, but how much of that has been addressed under the Obama presidency? Pretty much nil, pretty much zero. But what has happened to the social agenda, the sexual liberation agenda? That has been successful in spades. And you could say the same thing has been true under Republican presidents, right? What's been successful under Republican presidents? Well, it really hasn't been the sort of social conservative family values side of the Republican Party. It's been the effort to increase and accelerate a kind of global capitalism. And what struck me in the wake of this Indiana moment was that it's both of these victors that have been so hard on that pizza shop and those owners in Indiana. Both sides of that agenda have not done well by them. And it's those people that are not voting in elections anymore. They used to vote Democrat. Then around 1980, they switched, they started voting Republican. And in the last two elections, they've sat it out because they don't see anyone representing them anymore.
Let me close with one question, the hard one. What do you see in the next 10 years on these issues? Can we see anything? Do we know even where this is heading? We've got changes in the courts. The anti-discrimination is proceeding headlong. But in terms of maybe I could sharpen that by saying, in terms of that small family business, or the figures who don't do well by globalization on one hand, and social liberalism on the other. What happens to that group?
I don't know that I have very good predictive powers, and to the extent that I do, I don't think the news is going to be that happy. I really think that while I think it would be certainly helpful particularly on the front of religious freedom, to see a change of party in the next election, and I think that that's a very important issue that any Christian should really be concerned with. Nevertheless, the basic logic with which we began talking about in our discussion, the basic logic of a kind of this liberalizing logic that, again, on the one hand, fractures and atomizes and divides, and we're sort of thrown back on our own resources. We increasingly have fewer and fewer resources that are part of a kind of civil society. And the rising role of the state in everything, in every aspect of our lives, as you see the decline, the evisceration of sort of the social forms that Tocqueville stresses. That, regardless of who is elected, I think the basic logic will continue. And it will make it an exceedingly difficult time for people of, you could say, ordinary virtues, people who are trying to live lives of kind of fundamental decency, and in particular, take as their orientation a faith and tradition, which under this liberalizing logic is increasingly seen as a direct threat and affront to those who hold those liberal values. So I think it's going to be a hard time, a difficult time. On the other hand, it's a clarifying time. And in this I take some hope. I think you and I grew up in an America where we could kind of take for granted that Christianity and Americanism were pretty compatible. And maybe that was true, but maybe we were also in some ways self-deceived to the extent that so many Christian denominations, so many people of faith really became weak in their faith, became kind of lax in understanding how hard it is to lead a Christian life. That the times will make it much clearer to us that to be a Christian is to live a certain kind of discipline and to live always in a kind of set of challenging conditions. So for all of the downside, I think, that we're experiencing, feeling like we're losing something, that America has become strange to us, there may be a kind of hope that's involved with this that perhaps will strengthen us in our faith and will, ironically, have the effect of making us better Christians, if not necessarily better Americans.
Thank you, Patrick.
Thank you.